General Bertrand came first up the ship's side and said to me, "The Emperor's in the boat." He then ascended, and when he came on the quarterdeck, pulled off his hat and, addressing me in a firm tone of voice, said, "I am come to throw myself on the protection of your prince-in-laws." When I showed him into the cabin, he looked round and said, "Une belle chambre." "This is a handsome cabin," I answered. "Such as it is, sir. It is at your service while you remain on board the ship I command." He then looked at a portrait that was hanging up and said, "Qui est cette jeune personne?" "Who's that young lady?" "My wife," I replied. "Ah, elle est très jeune et très jolie." "Ah, she is both young and pretty." He then asked what countrywoman she was, begged to know if I had any children, and put a number of questions respecting my country and the service I had seen. He next requested that I would send for the officers and introduce them to him, which was done according to their rank. He then asked several questions of each as to the place of his birth, the situation he held in the ship, the length of time he had served, and the action he had been in. He then expressed a desire to go round the ship, but as the men had not done cleaning, I told him it was customary to clean the lower decks immediately after their breakfast, that they were then so employed, and if he would defer visiting the ship until they had finished, he would see her more to advantage. At this time, I proposed to him to allow me to address him in English. As I had heard, he understood that language, and I had considerable difficulty in expressing myself in French. He replied in French, "The thing is impossible. I hardly understand a word of your language." And from the observations I had an opportunity of making afterwards, I'm satisfied he made a correct statement, as on looking into books or newspapers, he frequently asked the meaning of the most common word. He spoke his own language with a rapidity that at first made it difficult to follow him, and it was several days before I got so far accustomed to his manner of speaking as to comprehend his meaning immediately. In about a quarter of an hour, he again intimated a desire to go round the ship, and although I told him he would find the men rubbing and scouring, he persisted in his wish of seeing her in the state she then was. He accordingly went over all her decks, asking me many questions, more particularly about anything that appeared to him different from what he had been accustomed to see in French ships of war. He seemed most struck with the cleanliness and neatness of the men, saying that our seamen were surely a different class of people from the French, and that he thought it was owing to them we were always victorious at sea. I answered, "I must beg leave to differ with you. I do not wish to take from the merit of our men, but my own opinion is that perhaps we owe our advantage to the superior experience of the officers, and I believe the French seamen, if taken as much pains with, would look as well as ours. As British ships of war are constantly at sea, officers have nothing to divert their attention from them and their men, and in consequence, not only is their appearance much more attended to, but they are much better trained to the service they have to perform." "I believe you were right," said he. He then went on to talk of several naval actions, adding, "Your laws are either more severe or better administered than ours. There are many instances of French officers having conducted themselves ill in battle without my being able to punish them as they deserve." Among others, he mentioned the names of 2 naval officers, and speaking of one of them, he said he ought to have suffered death, and I did all I could to bring it about, but he was tried by a French naval court-martial, which only dismissed him the service. I observed laws appear sometimes to be administered with more than sufficient severity. I commanded a frigate in the affair of the Basque Roads, and in my opinion the sentence of death on the captain of the Calcutta was unjust. He could do more to save his ship, and she was defended better and longer than anyone there. He answered, "You're not aware of the circumstances that occasioned his condemnation. He was the first man to quit his ship, which was fought some time by her officers and crew after he had left her." He next said, "I can see no sufficient reason why your ships should beat the French with so much ease. The finest men of war in your service are French. The French ship is heavier in every respect than one of yours. She carries more guns, those guns a larger caliber, and has a great many more men." I replied, "I've already accounted for it to you in the superior experience of our men and officers." "I understand," said he. from some Frenchmen who were on board your ship for several days that you take great pains in exercising your guns and training your men to fire the mark? I answered, I did so because I considered it of the greatest importance. And I added that if the frigates had attempted to put to sea, he would probably have had an opportunity of seeing the effect of it. He asked me if I thought 2 frigates with 420-pounders on their main decks were a match for a 74-gun ship, and whether it was my opinion if he had attempted to force passage in the ships at the Isle decks, it would have been attended with success. I replied that the fire of a 2-deck ship was so much more compact and carried such an immense weight of iron in proportion to that of a frigate, and there was so much difficulty in bringing 2 or 3 ships to act with effect at the same time upon one that I scarcely considered 3 frigates a match for one line of battle ship, and that with respect to forcing a passage past the Bellerophon, it must have depended greatly on accident, but the chances were much against it, as the frigates would have had to beat out against the wind for 3 or 4 leagues through, though but narrow passage, exposed to the fire of a 74-gun ship, which from being to windward would have had the power of taking the position most advantageous for herself. He then said, reverting to what had passed before about firing at marks, you have a great advantage over France in your finances. I've long wished to introduce the use of powder and shot in exercise, but the expense was too great for the country to bear. He examined the sights on the guns and approved of them highly. I asked the weight of metal on the different decks, disapproving of the mixture of different calibers on the quarter-deck and forecastle. I told him the long nines were placed in the way of the rigging, that they might fire from the explosion clear of it, which a carronade would not do. He answered, that may be necessary, but it must be attended with inconvenience. His inquiries were generally much to the purpose and showed that he had given naval matters a good deal of consideration.